The morning at Adelaide Cottage began the way most mornings had begun for the past several weeks. Quietly, carefully, and with a kind of heaviness that no one spoke about, but everyone felt. Kate moved through the kitchen with measured steps, filling the kettle, setting out 3 cups for the children, going through the motions of a routine she had built to keep herself steady. Outside, the autumn light was pale and thin, pressing against the window glass like it wasn't quite sure it had permission to come in. The children had been wonderful. That was the word Kate used whenever anyone asked, wonderful. George had become quietly protective in the way teenage boys sometimes do, hovering near her without making it obvious, offering to carry things she hadn't asked him to carry. Charlotte had taken to sitting close to her at the dinner table every evening. It's not always saying much, just being there with that warm, perceptive presence she had always carried. And Louis still made her laugh, which was its own kind of medicine. He didn't fully understand the weight on the house, but he understood his mother well enough to know when she needed something silly, and he delivered it without fail. Still, the evenings were long. After the children went to bed, the cottage settled into a silence that Kate had learned to fill with books, with soft television she barely watched, with letters she wrote and sometimes didn't send. William had been away for 3 weeks on a series of engagements that had extended longer than either of them had planned. Diplomatic commitments, formal tours, meetings that mattered and couldn't be moved. They spoke every night by phone, and the calls were good, warm, and honest and full of the kind of conversation that reminded her exactly why she had chosen this man. But phone calls, however good, are not the same as presence. She had not told him how tired she was. Not the deep kind, the kind that lives below the surface of a busy day and only shows itself at night when everything is still. She hadn't wanted him to worry. He had enough to carry on the road, enough meetings and handshakes and careful words, and she had promised herself she would be fine. She was fine. She was always fine. That morning, she had a short call with her private office about a rescheduled engagement. A gentle walk with the dog along the familiar path behind the cottage, and then a long, unhurried hour helping Louis finish a school project about the ocean. She had spread the papers across the kitchen table and listened to him explain the deep sea with enormous enthusiasm, and she had let herself be entirely present in that hour, laughing at his drawings of anglerfish and writing labels in her neat handwriting while he dictated them with great authority. By my mad afternoon, the project was done and pinned to the notice board. Louis had disappeared upstairs with the satisfied air of a man who had completed important work, and Kate was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea, reading through a small stack of correspondence. The house was calm. A car passed outside. The dog shifted in his basket. Everything was ordinary, and then she heard the sound. It wasn't loud, just the particular click of the front gate, the one that had a slight catch to it that William had been meaning to fix for months. Kate stilled. She set her cup down slowly. The gate clicked like that, for anyone, of course, for deliveries, for staff, for the school run pickup. She told herself that. She stayed very still and listened. And then she heard footsteps on the gravel path, a specific rhythm, a particular weight, the exact pace of someone she would have recognized anywhere in the world. Her breath caught. She moved to the window and looked out, and there he was. William, in a coat, slightly rumpled from travel, a bag over one shoulder, walking up the path with his head slightly bowed against the light wind. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. He had simply come, 3 days earlier than expected, without announcement, without fanfare. Just come home because he had looked at his schedule and looked at the phone and decided that being there mattered more than whatever remained on the itinerary. For a moment, Kate didn't move. She stood at the window and watched him walk toward the door, and something in her chest broke open in the quietest, most necessary way. Not sadness, or not only sadness. Relief, that was the word. The specific relief of someone who has been holding themselves together with great care and has just been told, without a single word being spoken, they don't have to do it alone. She was at the door before he knocked. When she opened it, they looked at each other for just a second, that single beat of recognition that happens between two people who know each other completely. and then William stepped forward and put his arms around her. And Kate pressed her face against his shoulder, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment. They didn't need to. The return had already set everything behind her. From somewhere upstairs came the thunder of small feet. Louis, who had apparently heard the gate from his bedroom window, and recognized it too. He came barreling down the stairs with the full force of a child who has no interest in composed reunions, shouting his father's name at a volume that was entirely unnecessary and absolutely perfect. William laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the stomach, and held out his free arm to catch his son without. Letting go of Kate, they stood in the doorway of the cottage as the pale autumn light came through. The three of them tangled together, and the heaviness that had been sitting in the house since William left began, slowly and gently, to lift. It was not a grand moment. There were no cameras, no crowds, no ceremony. Just a gate with a catch in it, footsteps on gravel, and a door opening before anyone had to knock. Just a woman who had been quietly brave for 3 weeks, and a man who had come home early because he knew it. Upstairs, Charlotte had heard the commotion. She appeared at the top of the stairs in her school jumper, looked down at the scene below her, and said nothing. She simply smiled, the small, private smile of someone who understood exactly what she was seeing. George would come home from school in an hour, and the whole evening would shift into the kind of warmth that only a full house can hold. But for now, in the doorway, the family was already beginning to breathe again. William had not told a single person he was coming back early. Not his private secretary, not the household staff, not even his protection officer, until they were already in the car heading for the airport. He had sat through the final morning of engagements in a polished room with polished people saying polished things. And somewhere between the third formal greeting and the fourth ceremonial photograph, he had made a decision that had nothing to do with protocol or schedules or what was expected of him. He was going home. His secretary, James Hartley, had received the news with the particular brand of carefully controlled alarm that senior royal staff are trained to maintain. There were things on the schedule. There were people who had arranged their days around the Prince of Wales's presence. William had listened to all of this with patience and then said simply and clearly that arrangements would need to be adjusted. Hartley had adjusted them. That was, after all, what good staff did. On the plane, William had not slept, though the flight was long enough that he could have. He had sat with the window shade half open, watching the pale stretch of cloud below. Thinking about the phone calls of the last 3 weeks, Kate was good on the phone, composed, warm, funny in the dry way she always was. She asked the right questions about his days, and answered his questions about hers with detail and lightness. And yet, there was something underneath the composure that he recognized the way you recognize a familiar song played slightly too softly, a quietness beneath the words. A tiredness she was managing carefully so he wouldn't notice. He had noticed. He hadn't said so, because naming it would have made her feel she had failed at something, and she hadn't failed at anything. She had simply been carrying more than one person should carry, doing it without complaint, doing it well, and doing it in a way that only someone paying very close attention would ever detect. William had been paying very close attention. When he arrived at Adelaide Cottage, he had expected the moment at the door to be brief. He knew Kate, knew she would pull herself together quickly, knew that children would make things noisy and funny and real within seconds. What he had not expected was the way she had already been at the door before he reached it. She had heard the gate. She had known the sound of his footsteps on the gravel. And she had opened the door not with careful composure, but with her face completely unguarded in a way that was so rare, so honest, that it stopped him for a breath. He had held on longer than usual, after Lois had launched himself at them both. The chaos of homecoming had properly begun. Kate had retreated to the kitchen to put the kettle on, which was her way of giving herself a moment to settle. William had always understood that. He took Louis into the sitting room and listened to a very detailed account of the anglerfish project. Examining the finished pages with the seriousness they deserved, Louis explained everything twice, as he often did, and William asked questions at each stage, genuinely interested. Because Louis's enthusiasm for things was one of the most disarming forces in the world. When Kate came back with tea, She was composed again, smiling, handing cups around, asking William about the last days of the tour with the kind of easy attention that meant she had fully switched back into herself. But she sat close. She sat with her shoulder just touching his in the way people do when they are reminding themselves that someone is actually there. Charlotte came down to join them after a while, dropping into her usual chair with a book tucked under her arm, occasionally looking up to contribute to the conversation with quiet precision. She had her mother's way of observing a room without appearing to, and that afternoon she observed it closely and said very little, in the manner of someone who understood that the important thing had already happened and didn't need to be talked about. Dinner that evening was louder than any dinner in the past. William had insisted on cooking, which was a decision that produced laughter from all three children and mild concern from Kate, who knew the specific limits of his kitchen abilities. He cooked pasta with great confidence and questionable results, and Louis declared it the best meal he had ever eaten, which was either a touching display of loyalty or a genuine reflection of a 7-year-old's standards. Charlotte ate 2 helpings without comment, which in her language was high praise. George, who had come home from school to find his father in the kitchen in an apron, had taken a moment to absorb the scene and then simply pulled out a chair and sat down. And the ease of that, the uncomplicated pleasure of being at a complete table, settled over all of them like warmth settling over a cold room. After dinner, William washed up while Kate helped Louis with his bedtime routine. And the ordinary domestic sounds of the evening filled the cottage in a way that felt almost ceremonial in its simplicity. Feet on stairs, water running, a door closing gently. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, William and Kate sat together in the sitting room with the lights low and the evening outside dark and still. They talked for a long time, properly talked, the way they only could without the presence of small ears and competing needs. He told her things about the tours that he hadn't found the right words for on the phone. She told him things about the weeks he had been gone that she hadn't wanted to say over a call. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that needed solving. Just the ordinary. The necessary business of 2 people letting each other back in after a time apart. At some point, she said, quietly, that she hadn't realized how much she had missed him until she heard the gate. William looked at her for a moment. Then he said that was why he had come back early. Because he had known, in the way that you know things about the person you have built a life with, that the gate needed to click. Kate laughed, a soft, real laugh, and leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the autumn night settled around the cottage. Inside, the family was whole again, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. The next morning arrived with a different quality of light. Not brighter, exactly, the sky was still the pale, washed gray of an English autumn, but somehow more generous. Kate noticed it first when she woke, earlier than usual, and lay still for a moment listening to the cottage breathe. William was asleep beside her, his breathing slow and steady, and the simple fact of that, the warmth and weight of another person in the room, made the morning feel different. From every morning of the past 3 weeks, she slipped out without waking him. The kitchen was cold and dim, and she moved through it in her dressing gown, filling the kettle, standing at the window while it boiled. The garden outside was still and quiet in the early gray light. The dog watched her from his basket with half-open eyes and then tucked his nose back under his paw. Satisfied that nothing remarkable was happening, Kate stood at the window and let herself feel without managing it the particular sensation of relief that she had been keeping carefully folded away since the night before. She had held herself together well across the past weeks. She was proud of that. In a private way she never said aloud. She had kept the children's routines steady, kept her own schedule moving, kept her voice even on the phone calls every night. She had done what was required, and she had done it without making it a performance. But holding yourself together takes effort that you don't always notice until the moment. You're allowed to stop. She had been allowed to stop last night. And this morning she was feeling the particular tenderness that comes after releasing something held tightly for a long time by the time William appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had made tea, cut fruit, and was sitting at the table with her hands wrapped around a warm cup, reading something on her phone, He came in rumpled and quiet, kissed the top of her head as he passed, and poured himself a cup without speaking. They sat together in the early morning silence in the way of people who were completely comfortable in the same room, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. Louis was the first of the children to appear. Thundering down the stairs with his usual early morning energy and arriving in the kitchen with big news, he had had a dream about an anglerfish. He was very keen to share every detail of this dream, which he did at considerable length, acting out several scenes with his arms. William listened with the grave attention of a man hearing an important briefing, and Kate watched them both and felt something warm move through her chest. Charlotte came down shortly after.
Already dressed.
Already composed. With her school bag on her shoulder and a look that said she had decided that Monday was something to be organized and dispatched efficiently. She poured herself juice, sat down, and informed Louis that dreams about anglerfish were not scientifically significant, which Louis refuted at once, and William quietly raised his eyebrows at Kate, who pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. George appeared last, still half asleep but cheerful in the muted way teenagers sometimes manage, and the breakfast table was full in the way it had not been for weeks. That morning, William had no engagements scheduled. His office had cleared the day deliberately transition time, they called it. The standard allowance for returning from a long overseas tour. He had never felt as grateful for that particular policy as he did now. He drove the younger children to school himself, which was not something he could always do, and which Louis celebrated as though he had won a significant prize. Charlotte walked between them to the car with quiet satisfaction, and in the back seat during the drive, she asked her father one careful question about something she had seen in the news about his tour, and William answered her fully and honestly, and she nodded and said nothing more. It was, he thought, one of the best 15-minute drives he could remember. When he returned to the cottage, Kate was in the garden, moving along the beds near the wall with her gardening gloves on, cutting back the things that needed cutting before winter settled in fully. She didn't look up when she heard him, just kept working. And he came and stood at the edge of the garden path and watched her for a moment, the focus of her, the ease of her in a space that was entirely her own. He asked if she wanted help. She handed him the smaller pair of gloves that she kept hanging on the garden gate and told him where to start. And for the next hour they worked side by side in the quiet gray morning, talking occasionally about nothing important, a program they both wanted to watch. Whether the rosemary needed replacing, something funny Charlotte had said the week before, ordinary things. The stuff of a shared life that travels no further than the people inside it. At one point, Kate straightened up and pushed her hair back from her face and looked at him with the small, direct look she had when she was about to say something real. She told him she was glad he came back early. She said it simply, without drama, looking at him over a tangle of garden clippings, and William understood what it cost her, not because it was painful, but because Kate rarely let herself need things out loud. She held things close, processed them quietly, and managed herself with a self-sufficiency that was both admirable and occasionally lonely. Saying that she was glad that she had needed him there was her way of opening a door she didn't always open. He told her he was glad he came back early too. They went on gardening. The dog appeared at the back door and pushed it open with his nose and wandered out to investigate the garden beds with the serious expression of a doggone important business. And Kate said something dry about his judgment of their pruning work, and William laughed. And the morning opened around them like something unlocked inside the cottage. The breakfast things were still on the table. The anglerfish project was still pinned to the notice board. Everything was exactly as it should be. Later, a member of staff came by with a small parcel of paperwork that needed William's attention, and he sat at the desk in the study for an hour while Kate worked on her own correspondence at the kitchen table. And the house held them both with the easy accommodation of a place that was genuinely lived in, genuinely loved. That evening, George came home from school with a complicated piece of homework and sat with William at the dining table for an hour working through it. And Kate listened to the low murmur of their conversation from the next room and felt the full, specific happiness of hearing her children and her husband occupy the same space. It was not a remarkable day. By any measure that the outside world might apply, there was no occasion, no announcement, no event worth reporting. Just a family moving through an ordinary Tuesday, slightly better than usual, because the person they had been missing was back where he belonged. By Wednesday, the word had quietly spread within the household that William had come back early. Staff spoke of it in the measured, careful way of people who understood the value of discretion, but were also privately moved by it. The housekeeper, who had worked at Adelaide Cottage for years and who had seen many things without comment, mentioned to the head of security simply that the prince had come home 3 days ahead of schedule and that the household was well. The head of security, a man named Daniel Holt, who had served the family with complete loyalty for 4 years, received this information with a brief nod that contained more warmth than it appeared to. Holt had noticed it himself. The morning after William returned, he had been on shift at the gate when William's car had come through early on Sunday evening, unannounced, and he had observed in the way that his job required him to observe everything, the way Kate had come to the door before William had reached it. He had looked away, as he always did, because some moments belong entirely to the people inside them. But he had registered it, and he had thought privately that there were things about this family that made the weight of the work entirely worth carrying. On Wednesday afternoon, Kate had a meeting at Kensington Palace, a planning session for a series of upcoming early childhood engagements that she had been developing carefully over many months. She dressed in her quiet, professional way, gathered her papers, and told William she would be back by 4. William said he would take care of school pickup. She paused in the hallway and looked at him for a moment, as if checking that this was real, and then she smiled, the genuine one, not the public one, and went. The meeting ran long, as meetings at the palace sometimes did. 3 hours became 4, and 4 became nearly 5. And Kate drove back through the early evening traffic with the focused, slightly drained expression of someone who had poured considerable energy into something they believed in, and was now in the process of refueling. She passed through the gates of the cottage just before 5, and as she came up the path, she heard the unmistakable sound of Louis laughing inside. Not his polite laugh, his real laugh. The one that started somewhere deep and came out helpless and complete. She opened the door to find the kitchen in a state of moderate, cheerful disorder. George was at the table doing homework and pretending not to be amused. Charlotte was standing near the counter with her arms folded and her eyes bright, which in her was equivalent to anyone else being in tears of laughter. Louis was on the kitchen floor, genuinely unable to stand up, entirely undone by whatever had just occurred. And William was standing in front of the hob, holding a pan and wearing an expression that combined dignity, surprise, and the specific guilt of a man who had attempted something ambitious in the kitchen and had received the consequences he deserved. Kate stood in the doorway and took in the scene. She asked what had happened. No one could answer immediately, because Louis was still on the floor, and Charlotte had put a hand over her mouth. George looked up from his homework and said, with great composure, that Dad had been trying to make a sauce. She looked at William. William told her the recipe had been misleading. The sauce, whatever it had been attempting to become, had apparently made a decision of its own and departed the pan at some point during the process. There was evidence of this departure on the hob, on the counter, and impressively on the front of William's shirt. Kate stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she laughed. Not the careful, contained laugh she sometimes deployed in public, but the real one, head back slightly, shoulders moving, completely unguarded. It filled the kitchen, and Louis on the floor laughed harder at the sound of his mother laughing. And Charlotte finally gave up and laughed properly. And George smiled at his homework in a way that meant he was grinning. William watched his wife laugh, and was entirely satisfied with the outcome. He had ordered food from the Thai place in Windsor by the time Kate had recovered enough to ask about dinner, and she had taken one look at the state of the hob and agreed that this was the right decision. Charlotte set the table with the efficient precision she brought to all domestic tasks. Louis, recovered from the floor, laid out the napkins in a pattern he considered artistic. George brought in the extra chair from the study. Kate made drinks and asked William, with her most innocent expression. Whether he thought he might try the recipe again? Sometime William said he needed more practice. Kate said she would prefer a warning next time. They ate at the kitchen table with the warmth of 4 people who had been through something together, who had spent 3 weeks in a kind of suspension and were now, slowly and properly, coming back to themselves. The food was good, the conversation was easy, and at one point all 3 children were talking simultaneously about 3 completely different things. And Kate caught William's eye across the table in the way parents do, a shared glance that said, "Without irony, can you believe this? Isn't it wonderful?" And William gave her the small nod that said yes. All of it yes. After dinner, while the children settled into their evening routines, Kate went upstairs and stood for a moment in the quiet of their room before changing out of her work clothes. She could hear the sounds of the house around her, Louis being herded toward a bath, Charlotte's door closing, George's music drifting faintly from down the hall, William's footsteps on the stairs, slower than the children's. Purposeful, she thought about the week, what it had been before Sunday, and what it had become since. The shift was not dramatic. This was not a story with a crisis or a rescue. It's not something that required grand gestures to make it make sense. It was simply the difference between a family with someone missing and a family made whole. That difference was, in every practical sense, enormous. William appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He asked how the meeting had gone. She said it had been good. Really good, actually. She told him about the new program framework they had agreed on, the plans that were beginning to take real shape, the work she was deeply proud of. He listened in the complete way he had, the way that meant he was actually hearing her, not waiting for his turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what she was saying. When she finished, he said he thought what she was building was going to matter to a great many people. Kate looked at him for a moment. Then she said she hoped so. She turned to change. And the ordinary evening continued around them. And the house held all of it. The laughter in the kitchen, the homework on the table, the sauce-stained shirt soaking in the laundry with the solid, unassuming permanence of a home that was exactly that. On Thursday, Charlotte asked her father a question over breakfast that neither of them had expected. She was halfway through her toast, reading something on her school tablet with her usual morning efficiency, and she looked up without any particular preamble and asked William if he thought it was hard. Being away, the table went slightly quiet. Louis looked up. George stopped pouring his juice and held the carton in mid-dash air. William considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He told Charlotte that yes, it was hard. That being away from the people you loved was always hard, no matter how important the reason. He said that the work mattered. He believed that completely, but that it didn't make the missing easier. Charlotte absorbed this. Then she said she had noticed that Mom had been very good about it. William said he knew. Charlotte went back to her tablet. It was, by Charlotte's standards, an unusually direct exchange, and everyone at the table understood its weight without discussing it. Kate, standing at the counter with her back half turned as she refilled the kettle, said nothing, but she was very still for a moment. Then she turned around with her cup and came to sit down. The morning carried on. The children left for school and the cottage settled into the mid-morning quiet. William had 2 calls scheduled with his office, catch-up work after the days of transition. And Kate had a private session with her photography, something she returned to whenever she had the space for it. A practice that was entirely her own and which she guarded with the calm firmness of someone who knew its value. She set up in the room she used for it, and for an hour the house was pleasantly occupied with 2 people doing their own quiet work under the same roof. Afterwards, she found him in the study, still at his desk, going through papers. She brought him coffee without being asked, and he looked up and thanked her. And she sat in the armchair by the window for a few minutes before she had to make calls of her own. The room was warm, and the morning light came through at a low angle, and neither of them spoke very much. And it was the best kind of quiet. Later that afternoon, they walked. It was something they tried to do when time and schedules allowed, a proper walk. Not the structured variety that came with public engagements, but an ordinary one with the dog and their own company, and no purpose other than covering ground together. The path behind the cottage wound through fields that were deep in autumn color, the leaves having turned to every shade of amber and rust, and the light was the particular gold of a late afternoon in October that somehow looked more like a painting than like weather. They walked without rushing. The dog ranged ahead and doubled back, extremely busy with things no human could evaluate. William talked about the tour more fully than he had before, not the public parts, but the private moments. A conversation with an elderly woman in a crowd, who had said something that caught him entirely off guard. A night in a hotel room, 3 time zones from home. When he had sat by the window and felt the distance with unusual sharpness, Kate listened. She asked questions. She did not rush him toward a conclusion or offer consolation before it was needed. And he knew this about her, that she was one of the few people in his life in front of whom he could simply be in the middle of a thought. Without anyone trying to resolve it prematurely, she talked to in turn. About the weeks, about a moment with Louis that had made her cry a little, about the strange way the house felt different when it was only her keeping it. She said she had surprised herself a few times with her own resilience. She meant, but also with how much she had felt the weight. She was not embarrassed by this. She simply said it plainly, the way she had learned to with him. And he took it in without making her feel that she had admitted to weakness. He told her he should have come back sooner. She told him he came back exactly when he needed to. They walked in silence for a while. The dog came back with something in his mouth that he was very proud of, and was persuaded to relinquish with some negotiation. The fields around them were still and golden and enormous, and the path stretched ahead, clear and unhurried. And they kept walking. When they turned for home, the light was beginning to lower toward the horizon. Kate tucked her hand into the crook of William's arm, and he covered her hand with his without looking down or breaking stride. And they walked that way all the way back to the gate that evening. When the children were home and the house was full and dinner was a proper, organized affair that William observed rather than produced, Kate stood at the kitchen window for a moment before calling everyone to the table. She looked at the garden in the dusk, at the bare branches of the things she had pruned earlier in the week, at the familiar edges of a space that was entirely hers in all the ways that mattered. She thought about Charlotte's question at breakfast. She thought about William on the path toward the door on Sunday evening, head slightly bowed, coming home because he had decided it mattered. She thought about the gate, the specific click of it, and how she had known, before she could even see him, that everything was about to get easier. She called the children in. The table filled. Someone knocked over a glass, and someone else laughed. And William passed the bread and asked George about something he had mentioned that morning. And Louis announced with great energy that he had 2 pieces of news, and one of them was very important. It was from the outside. An unremarkable evening in an ordinary family's home. But inside it, inside the laughter and the spilled water and the table crowded with people who had chosen each other and continued choosing each other, there was something that no public occasion, no formal ceremony, no carefully worded announcement would ever quite capture. There was just this: the house with the gate that clicked, the path with gravel, the door that opened before anyone had to knock, and the knowledge, quiet and solid as anything in the world, that home was not a place you returned to. It was a person. And she had been waiting at the door.